I love this story of Greenland and the Panama Canal. Because when it first came out, everyone laughed, thought ridiculous it was. And the more you learn about it, the more you're like, well, like, obviously, like, how's it not already done? Like, we need to do this. So let's focus on Greenland here. Why is it important that we control Greenland?
Well, the Arctic is basically America's back door. And for about 30 years, at least, since the end of the Cold War, we've left it relatively open and undefended. And for a period of time, that was okay. But now we're living in the age of, the return of empires, the multipolar world order in which both Russia and China are operating together to try to damage America's standing in the world, to threaten us, not just abroad, but closer to home. And one of the areas that Russia in particular has pointed out for, to become an area of Russian dominance is the Arctic. Greenland is a strategic location. It's sort of the linchpin for the whole region, and it's basically sitting open. And Denmark owns it technically, although there's some debate even about that. But they're not really doing anything with it. And there's maybe 56,000 people living there. It's this massive landmass. And by the way, it's chock full of mineable rare earth minerals. Denmark doesn't have the ability to mine for them. They turned to China during Trump's first term to try to get them to do it. And of course, that's what prompted Trump initially to say, we got to get Greenland. And he's continuing with that strategy because he knows the Chinese and now the Russians aren't stopping.
Okay, let's focus on Russia first. I counted, correct me if I'm wrong, please, I probably am, 18 military bases in northern Russia, in the Arctic region. Why do they have that there?
So it all goes down to mineable rare earth minerals and oil and natural gas. All of that is some of the world's largest untapped reserves are in the Arctic. Russia has like an 1,100-kilometer shoreline with the Arctic. In 2007, many people don't know this, but the Russians sent a submarine to the North Pole and planted a flag underwater in the North Pole. The indication was, or the symbol was, we're taking it. A year later, the Russians announced in their national strategy memo that the Arctic was becoming a Russian enclave, that it was actually more important to Moscow than even Ukraine or at the time Georgia was. So that shows you why they've been revitalizing those old Soviet naval bases in the Arctic. They're also, because of whatever's going on with the climate up there, there are these new waterways opening up. The Russians are building the world's largest icebreaker fleet to move the ice out of the way, to build the Northern Sea Route, which Russia says is going to become an alternative to the Suez Canal. So there's a lot of economic, military opportunities there, and the Russians have about a 10 to 12-year start on us in developing the Arctic.
Whoa, okay. All right, before we get to China, I got some questions. So we put the flag on the moon. They put their flag underneath the North Pole via submarine?
Yeah. And they were clearly, that was not just a little PR stunt. At the time, BBC and these other Western media sources sort of downplayed it. It was like a little cutesy thing that the Russians did. But everybody, I knew what it was. They were telling us, they were telegraphing what they're planning to do. And like I said, a year after that, that's when Moscow issued their national strategy memo, in which they said by 2020, they planned to basically control over half of the Arctic, which they did by 2020. And now there's a new round of national strategy documents being released by Moscow, which clearly indicate that not only are they going to expand upon that dominance, they're going to bring the Chinese with them. And so now we've got the Chinese crawling around in our backyard.
Okay. The icebreakers you mentioned, what are those? And these shipping lanes that could continue to be opened or widened, do you know what the benefit of those is? Because I know we've talked a lot about the Panama Canal recently and how that saved 22 days of going along the southern tip of South America. So like we're getting some I can visualize okay, we're saving 22 days. Got it.
Yeah.
What are we saving, or what whoever controls those, what would they be saving with shorter time?
That's a great question. The Russians have the Northern Sea Route. Of course, America and Canada are sitting on the Northwest Passage, the famous Northwest Passage. We can't use it because the United States and Canada are in a territorial dispute over who controls it, which is ridiculous. And by the way, this is why Trump's another reason he's talking about absorbing Canada is to settle that dispute in our favor. But the Russians, with their Northern Sea route, they're using nuclear-powered icebreakers. They have, I think, 7 of them or 8 of them. We have 2 very old non-nuclear icebreakers. We're having trouble building new icebreakers. So the Russians have a lead on us. They use those icebreakers to basically create paths in the ice for ships to follow through, either civilian container ships or military vessels, surface warships. And now the thing with this route is it basically connects Vladivostok, which is Russia's farthest port city on the Pacific Ocean, all the way up to the Baltic Sea of Northern Europe. And so basically this is being billed as a safer, easier route for ships to use. It's actually shorter for ships transiting through the Suez Canal rather than using the Suez Canal, which, as we remember, 2 or 3 years ago, there was these huge jams in the there was a ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. There's all the instability of the Middle East that we always have to worry about that could blockade Suez Canal transit routes. So this is bypassing the instability of the Middle East, basically by getting an international shipping to go through Russia's backyard, which of course will give them a lot of advantages.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a space base in Greenland?
Yeah, we have a Space Force facility in Greenland. It's a monitoring and tracking facility officially. There might be more going on there than meets the eye in terms of surveillance and whatnot. But yes, that is, we used to in the Cold War have basically an entire network of facilities and tracking stations in Greenland, throughout, going to Iceland, throughout Canada, that we maintained. That was part of our national defense for tracking incoming Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. Today, we don't have those capabilities the way we used to. We mothballed them at the end of the Cold War. I was speaking actually yesterday with a Russian in Russia. I was communicating with them over Zoom, and one of the things he said is the Russians are very worried about what Trump is saying, because not only could that allow for the Americans to possess the rare earth minerals of Greenland and have real, capabilities to compete with Russia economically for control over these trade routes up there, but more importantly, the Russian submarine force, which is probably their best naval asset, their submarines. They plan, if a war breaks out between the United States and Russia, they plan to basically sneak their nuclear submarine fleet underneath the ice of the Arctic, which is poorly defended, and to launch nuclear strikes on American East Coast cities by transiting through the Arctic, which we are not defending against. And so they're worried that we're going to plug that gap under Trump, and I think we will.